The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the wooden walls of the stable as the scent of wet earth filled the air. Inside, the horses stirred restlessly, their breaths clouding the cool night air. In the farthest stall, separated from the others, a young colt stood trembling, his dark coat slick with sweat and his legs barely able to support his weight. His large, frightened eyes darted around as heavy footsteps echoed through the stable. Mr. Calloway, a man whose fortune had been built on a lifetime of calculated victories, stopped before the stall. He was a man of presence, his tailored coat untouched by the storm that raged outside, his expression as cold as the night itself. The stable master, an older man with deep lines carved into his face, shifted uncomfortably as he followed behind. "It's no use, sir," the stable master muttered, his voice thick with resignation. "This colt will never be what you need him to be. He's too small, too weak. His spirit isn't there." Mr. Calloway barely spared the man a glance before turning his sharp gaze back to the trembling colt. He had invested in champions, in bloodlines meant for greatness, but this one was an anomaly, a mistake that did not fit within his world of perfection. His lip curled slightly in disgust. "Get rid of it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I don't care how. Just make sure I never see it again." The colt flinched at the harshness of his tone, though he did not understand the words. The stable master hesitated, his fingers tightening around the railing of the stall. He had seen this colt struggle to stand on wobbly legs, had watched the quiet determination in his dark eyes, and yet there was nothing he could do. With a reluctant nod, he obeyed. By midnight, the colt was gone. Driven far beyond the estate, past the manicured fields and pristine fences, he was dumped on the outskirts of town, where the shadows stretched long and the wind howled through the empty streets. He stood motionless, his frail body shivering against the cold. The hunger gnawed at his belly, but worse was the overwhelming fear. Alone, abandoned, he had no understanding of what he had done to deserve such rejection. Officer Daniel Carter sat slumped in his patrol car, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee as the rain pattered against the windshield. His shift was nearly over, but exhaustion clung to his limbs like a heavy weight. Years ago, he had been someone else, a man whose life had revolved around the rhythmic pounding of hooves against dirt, the thrill of the track. But fate had other plans. Now his world was filled with sirens and late-night patrols, far removed from the past he had buried. He exhaled heavily, his breath fogging up the glass. He had been about to start the engine when something moved at the edge of the alleyway ahead. Squinting against the darkness, he saw it, a small, frail figure standing amidst the trash bins and broken pavement. He frowned, stepping out of the car, the cold rain soaking into his uniform within seconds. As he approached, the figure shifted uneasily, trying to retreat, but too weak to run. A horse. No, a colt. Daniel's brows knit together as he took in the sight. The colt was drenched, its coat matted with dirt, ribs faintly visible beneath its slick skin. Its legs trembled as if they might give out at any moment. "Easy there, bud," Daniel murmured, lowering himself slightly to appear less threatening. He knew horses well enough to recognize the signs of fear, the whites of the eyes showing, the tension in every muscle. The colt flinched, but didn't bolt. It couldn't. Glancing around, Daniel wondered where it had come from. A stray horse wandering through the city. Highly unlikely. Someone had dumped him, abandoned him like garbage. Something deep in his chest twisted at the thought. His fingers flexed against the damp fabric of his uniform as the memory stirred. He had seen this before. A creature, tossed aside for being less than perfect. He took another step closer. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." The colt flicked its ears, but remained still. That was all the permission Daniel needed. Without another thought, he slipped off his jacket and carefully draped it over the colt's back, shielding it from the rain. The young horse shuddered but didn't resist. Daniel had made his decision. By the time they arrived at his small countryside home, the storm had eased into a steady drizzle. The barn out back was old but sturdy, a remnant of the life Daniel had once known. He guided the colt inside, speaking in low, soothing tones. The moment the colt stepped onto the dry straw, its legs buckled, and it collapsed with a soft grunt. Daniel was beside him in an instant, hands hovering uncertainly before settling gently against the damp coat. "You're safe now." The colt didn't understand the words, but in the quiet of the barn, something shifted. A trust not yet fully formed, but not entirely absent either. The next morning, Mia arrived just as the first rays of sunlight cut through the mist. She was a veterinarian and one of the few people Daniel still allowed into his life. Her sharp eyes softened the moment she saw the colt curled in the corner of the stall. "You found yourself a new project, huh?" she said, crouching beside Daniel as he ran a brush over the colt's side. The animal twitched but remained still under his touch. "Didn't really plan on it," Daniel admitted, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The moment he had seen the colt, something in him had recognized the fight in those dark eyes. Mia examined the young horse carefully, her hands firm but gentle. "He's malnourished, dehydrated, probably never received proper care. If you're planning on keeping him, it's going to take time." Daniel nodded. He knew that. He had spent years training champions, molding wild energy into controlled power. But this colt wasn't a project. He wasn't a means to an end. He was something more. Mia stood, brushing her hands off on her jeans. "You thinking of giving him a name?" Daniel glanced at the colt, considering. He had survived against the odds. He had been thrown away and still refused to give in. "Shadow," Daniel said finally, "because even when they try to get rid of him, he's still there." The name settled into the space between them like a promise. The colt lifted his head slightly, ears twitching at the sound. Mia smiled. "Shadow it is, then." Daniel let his hand rest against the colt's neck, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breath. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him. Hope. The first rays of dawn filtered through the wooden slats of the barn, casting long shadows over the hay-strewn floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh straw, mingling with the faint musk of the young colt lying curled in the corner. Shadow stirred, his dark eyes fluttering open as the world slowly came into focus. His body ached, stiff from exhaustion and hunger, but the warmth of the barn was a stark contrast to the cold streets he had been left to perish in. He was still here. He had survived another night. Daniel leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, watching the colt carefully. There was something in the way Shadow carried himself, a quiet resilience that reminded him of his own past. The colt was still skittish, hesitant to trust, but he no longer shrank at every movement. That was progress. "Morning, Bud," Daniel murmured, stepping inside the stall with slow, deliberate movements. He crouched down, extending his hand just enough for the colt to catch his scent. Shadow flared his nostrils, his ears flicking back before inching forward slightly, sniffing at the unfamiliar touch. Daniel remained still, waiting. Trust wasn't built overnight. Mia arrived a short while later, her veterinarian's bag slung over one shoulder. She took one look at Daniel sitting in the straw beside the colt and smirked. "You know, most people who say they don't want another responsibility don't spend their mornings bonding with a half-starved horse." Daniel exhaled a quiet laugh, but didn't look away from Shadow. "Yeah, well, guess I don't listen too well." Mia knelt beside them, her practiced hands running over Shadow's frail body, checking the progress of his recovery. "He's getting stronger," she noted. "Still underweight, but he's drinking more water. That's a good sign." Daniel reached out, running a slow hand along Shadow's neck. The colt stiffened but didn't pull away. Another step forward. Mia sat back on her heels, watching Daniel as much as she was watching the horse. "You really think you can turn him into something?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but I do know I can't just leave him like this." Mia studied him for a moment, then nodded. She understood. The days passed in a steady rhythm. Each morning, Daniel would rise before the sun, stepping into the barn with quiet patience. He didn't push, didn't demand trust where it hadn't been earned. He simply showed up. And slowly, Shadow began to change. The colt started standing a little taller, moving with a touch more confidence. His ribs weren't as stark beneath his coat, and his once hesitant steps became more assured. The first time he took a carrot from Daniel's open palm, something inside the man loosened, like an old wound beginning to heal. But progress came with setbacks. One afternoon, Daniel led Shadow out into the small paddock behind the barn, the sun warm against his skin as the colt took in the unfamiliar space. The breeze carried the scent of grass and open sky, a stark contrast to the enclosed world he had known. Daniel gave him room, letting him move at his own pace. But as soon as Shadow took his first uncertain steps into the open, something shifted. A distant sound, perhaps a car backfiring, perhaps nothing at all, sent a bolt of fear through the young horse. His ears pinned back, muscles tensed, and before Daniel could react, Shadow reared, eyes wide with panic. Daniel moved instinctively, reaching out to calm him, but the colt twisted away. His hooves struck out wildly, catching Daniel off guard, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Shadow bolted. Daniel barely registered the sting in his arm as he scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had known this would happen eventually. Fear was a stubborn ghost, refusing to release its grip so easily. But watching Shadow flee, terror overriding every ounce of progress they had made, ignited something fierce inside him. Shadow! His voice cut through the open air, steady but firm. The colt skidded to a halt just before reaching the far fence, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. His eyes were still wild, his entire body quivering. But he had stopped. He had listened. Daniel took a slow step forward, holding out a hand. "It's all right, bud. You're safe." Shadow hesitated, caught between instinct and something else, something unfamiliar. Trust. Minutes stretched between them before the colt finally took a tentative step back toward him. Daniel exhaled, his muscles unclenching as he gently placed a hand on Shadow's neck. The colt flinched, but didn't pull away. "That's it," Daniel murmured. "We're getting there." That night, as the barn settled into silence, Daniel sat outside Shadow's stall, his back resting against the wooden beams. The adrenaline from earlier had faded, replaced by an ache in his ribs and an even deeper exhaustion in his bones. But despite everything, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Shadow hadn't run away. He had come back. The following weeks tested them both. There were days Shadow moved with confidence, his steps lighter, his spirit stronger. And then there were days where the past clung to him like a shadow, his trust faltering, his fears surfacing. But Daniel didn't waver. He had once thought he was done with this world, with training, with second chances. But Shadow had forced him to confront a truth he had long buried. He needed this just as much as the colt did. One crisp morning, Daniel stood at the paddock fence, watching Shadow move. The colt had filled out, his coat now sleek and rich, his once hesitant steps carrying a new sense of purpose. He was still rough around the edges, but there was something else in him now, determination. Mia leaned against the fence beside him, arms crossed. "You know, I've seen a lot of things, but I don't think I've ever seen a horse change a man the way this one has." Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Maybe I needed saving as much as he did." Mia smiled, but her gaze turned thoughtful. "You ever thought about what's next?" Daniel exhaled, watching as Shadow tossed his head, a new fire in his eyes. "I think it's time to see what he's really capable of." Here's the final section of your story, bringing everything to a satisfying and emotionally impactful conclusion. Let me know if you'd like any refinements. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves. A faint mist clung to the ground as Daniel stood by the paddock, watching Shadow move. There was a fluidity to his steps now, a confidence that hadn't existed when he first arrived. The colt's dark coat gleamed under the rising sun, his muscles no longer frail but strong, lean, and filled with unspent energy. He wasn't the same broken creature that had once cowered in an alleyway. He had transformed. But now came the hardest part. Daniel tightened the reins in his hands, exhaling as he stepped toward Shadow. The colt turned his head, ears flicking forward, sensing the shift in Daniel's energy. They had spent weeks building trust, learning to move together, learning to understand each other. And today would be the real test. Mia leaned against the fence, arms crossed as she observed. "You sure he's ready for this?" Daniel glanced at her before turning his attention back to the colt. "Only one way to find out." The saddle was unfamiliar to Shadow, despite the gradual introduction over the past few weeks. His muscles tensed beneath Daniel's touch as the leather was placed carefully on his back. His nostrils flared, ears twitching at every slight sound. "It's all right, bud," Daniel murmured, his voice steady, reassuring. He moved slowly, fastening the girth, allowing Shadow to feel the weight before taking a step back. The colt shifted but didn't panic. That was good. The real challenge came when Daniel placed a boot in the stirrup. The moment he applied pressure, Shadow's body went rigid. Daniel hesitated, waiting for the tension to subside, before slowly swinging himself into the saddle. For a split second, the world seemed to still. Then Shadow exploded. He reared violently, hooves striking the air as a sharp whinny cut through the silence. Daniel gritted his teeth, keeping his weight low, his hands firm but gentle on the reins. The colt's fear was a living thing, a wildfire threatening to consume every ounce of progress they had made. Mia sucked in a breath, gripping the fence. "Daniel, I got him," he called back, his voice calm despite the chaos beneath him. Shadow twisted, trying to shake him, trying to rid himself of the weight, of the ghosts of his past that still whispered in his ears. But Daniel didn't let go. He moved with him, not against him, his muscles burning as he fought to stay balanced. Minutes stretched like hours until, finally, Shadow's movement slowed. His breaths came in ragged bursts, his muscles quivering beneath the saddle. He was afraid, but he was still here. He hadn't run. Daniel leaned forward, placing a hand against the colt's damp neck. "You're all right. You did good." Shadow's ears twitched, his breathing gradually evening out. The tension in his body ebbed away, replaced by something else, understanding. Mia let out a breath of relief. "You're either the bravest or the stupidest man I've ever met." Daniel chuckled, running a hand through his damp hair. "Maybe a little of both." Over the next few weeks, Shadow learned. He stumbled, he resisted, but he never stopped trying. And Daniel was there for every moment. There were nights he sat in the barn long after the world had gone quiet, just watching the colt sleep, thinking about how different life had become. He hadn't expected to find a second chance in a creature that had been cast aside. And yet, here they were. News spread quickly about the mysterious colt that had been abandoned and nursed back to strength. Whispers reached the edges of town, and eventually, they reached Mr. Calloway. It was late one evening when the sound of a sleek black car pulling into the driveway sent a ripple of unease through Daniel. He stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed as the door swung open and Calloway emerged. The man's presence was as sharp as ever, his suit pristine, his expression unreadable as his eyes scanned the property before settling on Daniel. "Officer Carter," he greeted coolly. "I hear you've been keeping something that belongs to me." Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew this moment would come. He stopped being yours the day you threw him away. Calloway smirked, but there was no warmth behind it. "You've done a fine job with him, I'll admit, but let's not pretend you have the right to keep him." Daniel's grip on the railing tightened. "You didn't want him. Why come back now?" Calloway took a measured step forward. "Because now he's worth something." His gaze flicked toward the paddock, where Shadow stood, ears pricked as if sensing the tension in the air. "I made a mistake. I can see that now, and I'm prepared to pay generously to correct it." Daniel's muscles coiled, anger simmering beneath the surface. He had seen men like Calloway before, men who valued only what they could control, who discarded what they deemed unworthy only to reclaim it when it suited them. He shook his head. "Not happening." Calloway's smirk faded. "You don't have the authority to make that decision." Daniel took a step down from the porch, his stance unwavering. "Then take me to court. Explain to a judge how you abandoned an injured colt in the middle of nowhere. I'd love to see how that plays out." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken threats. Calloway's fingers twitched at his side before he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake." "No," Daniel corrected. "You did." Without another word, Calloway turned on his heel, disappearing into the car. The engine roared to life, and just like that, he was gone. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders finally relaxing. He turned toward the paddock, meeting Shadow's gaze. The colt huffed, tossing his head as if sensing the weight that had just been lifted. Daniel walked over, reaching out to run a hand along the colt's strong neck. "You're home, bud." Shadow pressed into the touch, a quiet understanding passing between them. In the days that followed, Daniel made a decision he never thought he would. He entered Shadow into a local exhibition race, not for competition, not for accolades, but as a final test. A chance for Shadow to prove, not to the world but to himself, that he was more than what he had been told he was. The morning of the race was electric. The air hummed with anticipation as horses lined up at the track, their riders poised with quiet determination. Daniel stood beside Shadow, tightening the bridle as he met the colt's steady gaze. "We don't have to win," he murmured. "We just have to finish." Shadow flicked his ears, exhaling sharply as if he understood. The gate swung open, and they were off. The pounding of hooves against dirt sent vibrations up Daniel's spine, but he didn't focus on the others. He focused on Shadow, the way his muscles stretched, the way his breathing remained steady. For the first time, there was no fear in the colt's movements, no hesitation, only the sheer force of will that had kept him alive all this time. They didn't win, but when they crossed that finish line, it didn't matter. Mia met them at the gate, a wide grin stretching across her face. "Well," she asked. Daniel dismounted, patting Shadow's damp neck as pride swelled in his chest. "We did it." Shadow had been discarded, forgotten, left to fade into nothing. But against every